Welcome to RevOps Revolution, where we focus on changing the game for driving revenue. I'm your host, Jesse Morris, and each episode we take a look at the different areas that affect change and drive revenue across your organization. If this is your first time joining us, please subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episode. Here's to the revolution. Welcome to another day of the revolution. I'm your host, Jesse Morris, and today we're going to continue our journey talking through fiscal year planning model. I've broken these into really 4 mini sessions. I think when I started off, I was hoping to get more into some of these, but I didn't want to make them too long. So today, this episode is going to be really focused on cost modeling for fiscal year planning. So up until this point, if you haven't caught some of my earlier episodes, I talked through our sales modeling and really our board level target modeling, how we're doing quota assignment, all of that at a really high level. I then did another episode around marketing and some of the different marketing models we can run within it as well. And today we're going to be really focused on cost modeling. And then my very last episode, we're going to round out with sales compensation planning. All of these episodes are meant to be around 10 to 13 minutes long. So they're just quick things to give you some really good food for thought of how you go into planning and modeling and some important considerations when you're doing that. All right, so let's dive into it. We've talked a lot about what data is needed for inputs on the sales and marketing modeling side. Let's just reinforce a couple key things on the cost side. So a couple big questions you have to ask yourself. Obviously, number one is, are we winning? Is what we're doing working today? That feels very obvious. But it's a really important question because if we're not, then our ability to model either means we have to tweak how we're doing things, and also utilizing some of our historical data makes it a little bit more challenging. Secondly, generally, it also comes potentially with some type of funding or more cash in the bank to put back into the business for investments. And so as we're going into planning, it is a good idea to get a sense from the board, A, of what their expectations are, and B, from a funding perspective, are we getting additional investment going into this next year to really get our wheels turning? Doesn't mean we build only models around that. We do want to get a sense if we don't really take much additional investment, what would that translate into from a productivity perspective? But ultimately, that's a really good question to ask. Number two is, how did we do last year on expenses? And that's really looking in 4 key areas. One is salaries. That's probably pretty obvious. 2 is your non-personnel costs. So things like travel and entertainment, software expenses, some of those other components within enablement, training, all these different things that really add up outside of our sales related costs. Now, what I like to do generally is create a ratio. So saying, hey, for every new hire we bring on board, I'm going to have to assume, I'm making this up, $1,000 each month in additional software cost, and another $2,000 each month in travel for every AE we bring on board. And so getting a good idea around ratios can be very helpful. And so it's really plug and play. So as you build out how many new hires we're going to have next year, your other kind of non-personnel cost increase within that. Number 3 is pensions, taxes, benefits. I work with an international company, and so especially in Europe, depending on what country you're working with, those pension costs can be really high and they can change very regularly. And so you want to make sure you look back and reevaluate your assumptions. So, in the US, a lot of times I'll use a 20% factor. So any comp or offer I'm expecting, I add 20% on top of it to really try to cover the amount we're going to have to pay in taxes and benefits. I've seen that assumption as high as 25%, depending on how good of benefits you have. In Europe, I've seen that as high as 50%. Places like France and even the UK actually have really rich benefits for employees. And so your factors are going to be higher at a country level. So even just modeling at a European level sometimes can actually not be granular enough because it varies widely across Europe and how you're looking at that. So those are really important factors. Also, getting a sense from the people and culture team, are there additional benefits we want to offer this year? And do we need to factor those in as well? So that's another really big one. And the last one, which I'm going to spend some time on in another episode talking about actually how to structure and plan, do comp plans, but the compensation piece of this. And this is the one, the variable comp piece within a sales org in particular. can be very challenging. And so getting a really good sense of where did you end up this past year? Where did you end up the year before? How close to what we modeled versus what we actually did versus, where our goals were set or how much overachievement we had. All of that's really relevant. So doing analysis within that. I also like to run like a Monte Carlo simulation on my comp plans where I'm looking at, okay, if a lot of companies will say, let's just assume that 70% of reps achieve 100% attainment. That's like the metric that most of us look for, 60 to 70%. The challenge with that is accelerators. And so if you don't model out 30% of those reps actually achieved 150%, 30% of those reps achieved less than 30%, and then you have a bunch of reps that maybe achieve somewhere in that 70 to 100%. And so modeling out different scenarios to get a good sense on the cost side can be very valuable as we look forward. So those are some of the major pieces of information we want to make sure we have when we start out. We need to get a good sense too of ramping. So in the sales org, especially, the more segmentation you have with new hires, the better you can get at understanding ramp times and sales cycles. So think about it this way, and most of you are familiar with this. But what I like to do is put schedules together, and those schedules we'll use throughout the year. So as we make new hires throughout the year, maybe a rep leaves and we got to bring a new rep on. How do we, assign the quota out? We already have our model set up going into the year. So we don't have to do much at all except figure out the start month of when somebody starts to do that. General rule of thumb, and I'm gonna go very general here, but for your AEs in the bunch, your S&B reps generally get a 1 quarter ramp. Your commercial reps or mid-market reps generally get a 2 quarter ramp, and your enterprise rep generally get a 3 quarter ramp. Now, one of the assumptions, if you want to be a little more conservative, you can say, okay, the quarter they start in is not considered really the first quarter. It's really their first full quarter at the company. This is a very important definition, by the way. This is one that I've had to deal a lot with finance on over the years where we didn't get very clear up front of the definition of a ramped rep and when that begins. So I'd highly encourage you to write that out. Make sure you've got policies in place and agreement and alignment across the sales org and finance all around the ramp schedules. Very important. So understanding ramp times, and then also in the comp planning, which we'll talk more about in a follow-up episode. But one of the other things is guarantees or draws. And so obviously that's going to affect cost outlay is how much are you paying for that for how long as well. Now, generally, not all reps get that. Your enterprise reps are more likely to get it, but I've seen myriad of companies that will do that within it. The other thing on the quota side is I've seen both assigning out full quotas and essentially a guaranteed rate. There's a myriad of ways to do that as well. So understanding how you're doing your comp plans obviously is going to play into the cost side of the equation. So that's really going to help us get a good sense on the AE side as well. Now the AM side as well, I'm generally running a separate segmentation model if you have AMs within your business to get a sense of how long does it take them to ramp. So this is an area too, ramp. I do want to take a second and double click on it. A lot of companies just make assumptions. They say, well, 3 months or 2 quarters is the industry average, whatever it is, and we're going to go with that. But they don't actually evaluate their data and look back and say, okay, out of all the new hires I've made over the last few years, how long in did they have their first sale? And a follow-up question to that is, how long did they have their first sale that they generated the pipeline for? Because a lot of times these reps will come in as backfills or maybe come into a patch that's already somewhat developed. And so it's great if they're closing deals sooner, but it's also really important to know how long does it take us if we don't have any pipeline set up for us to generate pipeline and then close that pipeline. That's a really big pitfall I've seen come and bite companies. And so a lot of times I'm assigning different quotas for new territories, undeveloped territories versus a backfill or maybe inheriting part of a territory, maybe splitting a territory in half. That's really going to be a factor when we're signing quotas out going forward. So both of our AEs are going to have their own ramp schedule and our AMs generally. Generally, your AMs are going to ramp faster than AEs because they're taking over accounts. Again, run the data analysis. How long does it take generally for an AM to get in, build relationships, and create new upsell opportunities? That's really key. Not just close their first upsell opportunity, but close their first one that they created. That's a really big data point behind it. So as we're building these models out, that's really what we're looking for. And then you're really going to take your additional headcount. So your SEs, your RevOps roles, your sales enablement roles, maybe other support roles within the go-to-market function. and build that in as when are you going to hire those people, and try to be realistic with this. The other thing I like to do on the cost modeling side too is, if let's say we have a good investment going into the year, we kind of sometimes want to see, you obviously want to get hires in as soon as possible to actually impact that year with some of the longer ramp times on enterprise. But something really important to note within this process is we want to see if things are working, because I've seen companies, they try to do this hyper growth thing. They maybe don't have a great strategy. Maybe they're going to a new market. It just takes longer than they expected. So instead of just putting all of your money in up front, obviously there's advantages to putting a lot up front to try to actually impact that fiscal year, holding some back, and especially the support role side, and saying, okay, if we actually achieve our first and second quarter, we are going to release more funds going into the H2. And so that's another really good strategy, is to get a sense. So I'm typically front loading the halves generally. So I'm saying, okay, a lot of my people, I want to start the new hires. I want to start the beginning of the first quarter of the new fiscal year. And then I'll put another big tranche of individuals starting the third quarter, the beginning of the third quarter, the beginning of the second half of the year. Again, that's so I can get a good sense of, are we on track? And what that helps us do is not get too far ahead of our skis. If we maybe miscalculated some things, if hires maybe took a little bit longer, whatever the case may be, that can be really helpful, and not having to get in situations where you're having to cut cost as well, which I've seen that scenario play out. So those are some of the major factors when we're doing cost modeling. On the non-personnel costs, I talked about that a little bit earlier. But again, I would highly encourage the ratio approach to say, for every new hire with this type of role, here's the assumed additional costs we're going to take on as a company. And then also really thinking through gaps as we're going into next year from a support perspective, and how does that play in. Another last one, obviously, is all around retention and renewals. Depending on how big of a challenge that is for you, that could be something you're going to take a closer look at and say, you know what, we're going to put some renewal specialists in. Generally, and we'll talk about this on comp plannings side of things, but that also is a way that you can tend to bring on a little bit lower cost resources to manage those high velocity clients, which will free up your account managers, your AEs, whoever's running your larger deal upsells, and allow them to focus on the areas that they should be focused on. That's another area of cost consideration when we're thinking about ratios, support, et cetera, going into it. Hope this was a helpful overview of just some factors to consider when we're doing cost modeling. Ultimately, you're really just building out a waterfall and a salary run rate models to really get a good sense of how is cost going to kind of outlay throughout the year, and really tracking and monitoring that going forward. Hit like, subscribe to continue to follow along as we get to impact change across our organizations in the industry. To the journey.